In the 1980s, Ed Wernick was the biggest name in curling as a player. Warren Hansen was the biggest name in curling as a bureaucrat. And when Ed Wernick and Warren Hansen clashed, it was like comic opera. It was like nitro and glycerin.
Both of them loved the sport. They just looked upon it in a different way.
They've basically taken a stranglehold of our game, and they don't have to answer to anybody.
It was what I represented and what I was trying to accomplish, and he didn't agree with it.
I couldn't stand him then, couldn't stand him later, and I can't stand him now.
I mean, how do you take a game that's viewed as a hobby and develop it all the way up into an Olympic sport? A lot of people just couldn't fathom that.
To go to the Olympics, it's not just a curler's dream, it's every athlete's dream because it's the biggest sporting event in the world.
The game was stuck between the old traditions and moving towards something new.
It was a battle for the soul of the sport. It was a battle for who was right. It was a battle of the curlers versus the bureaucrats.
Curling is a disc, and you actually try to push it to a circle at the end of the runway, and it's called a house where it lands.
I think it's great. It's always been in Canada, and to have an event in the US in such an iconic place.
It's going to be a lot of fun. A lot of Canadians are going to come down and watch this great event.
Having a curling event of this magnitude in Las Vegas would have been a dream 30 or 40 years ago. It was up there probably with the sport ever becoming Olympic. Curling has done very well. It has taken on a whole life of its own with regard to its awareness and its understanding around the world. Am I surprised that we made it to where we have? Yes and no. Nothing is easy. And certainly to try and bring a sport to a level where it can become an Olympic sport, it was anything but a smooth ride.
Curling back in the 1960s and 70s was really an old boys sport. It was played by plumbers and lawyers and gardeners, and it was kind of the boys' night out. Every small town in Canada at that time was said to have had three things. One was a Chinese food restaurant, one was a post office, and one was a curling club. And that curling club became the hub of the community in the winter months. And in every one of these centers during the winter, they would host a bonspiel, which is the big tournament.
Maybe 50, 60, 70 teams would show up. They come from everywhere. Bondspieling was sort of like a tradition. We would basically start late September and go for about 8 or 9 straight weeks all over the country.
If you're going to talk about curling in the 70s, you have to talk about drinking, because curling was based on the foundation of being a social sport.
There was ashes on the ice. There was ashtrays on the walkways between sheets. I mean, you'd see guys coming out of the hack with a cigarette in their mouth.
The main event, the Briar, was sponsored by a tobacco company. So it was a different time.
You had guys like Heck Gervais, who was a big personality. And then you had young guys like Paul Gausel, who really came in as the rebel in the sport. And then in Ontario, you had the rise of this guy named Ed Wernick, who was this kind of short, stocky guy. He looked like he was built like a fire hydrant, which was good because he was a firefighter. And he loved being a firefighter, very proud of it, but he loved curling even more.
Eddie was not just a great curler. Eddie was very smart at understanding how to put together a great team.
He really came to the forefront when he hooked up with Paul Savage and John Kawaja and Neil Harrison.
We were basically known as a first aggressive team.
Well, after 4 or 5 events, we looked around and kind of said to each other, you know, we're pretty good. And we just got in this mode of nobody's going to beat us.
We started barnstorming through Western Canada and winning cash, and they were really living large. Then they got into the Briar, the Canadian Championship, the pinnacle that every curler wants to get to.
Oh, and a big shot. He has to be very careful. It's on its way. They're really working it. That rock is starting to cut it.
Ontario has won the Briar.
Eddie Wernick.
It was tremendous. I was so pumped. Like, it wasn't a one-night party, I can tell you that.
This has really been a lifelong dream for you.
You know, 24 years I put into this game, and our fans, I want to thank all the fans. Without their support, it wouldn't have meant as much.
He was a wizard. He was a great strategist, great ice reader. He looked at curling like a pool table, like angles and everything else.
You're going to get a piece of it. Oh, he just got it.
Eddie was the master.
Falling away from the Alberta rock all the way down the sheet.
It was incredible to witness the love that curling fans had for Ed Wernick.
They call him the Wrench, the best curler in the world.
Eddie's personality was literally larger than life.
They loved the character, the unspokenness, the honesty.
He was a cult hero to thousands and thousands of curling fans.
Eddie Wernick became a big celebrity in the curling circles, but you know, if you went into wider circles, there were people who really didn't know a lot about curling, and they sort of looked at it as, you know, silly sweeping, like they were sweeping their kitchen floors. And there was still a stigma behind it, that it wasn't a real sport, that it was maybe just a pastime or a hobby. Amongst the people who were involved in curling, there were a lot who wanted to try and change the image of it. One of those guys was a guy named Warren Hansen.
I, for one, very early in the game, because of my athletic background, was always physically fit curling. I was a sweeper, so I worked on lifting weights. I was always in good shape. In 1974, we earned the right to represent Canada at a World Championship in Bern, Switzerland. Where at that point in time, Hector Gervais, our skip, smoked. He was a chain smoker, and he smoked on the ice the entire time. Now the Swiss press crucified us because this big man was out there smoking. We also faced some conditions with stones that was absolutely horrendous. We ended up finishing third. I had just this huge emptiness and feeling inside of me of saying, I've worked for the last 15 years of my life to get to this point, and is this all there really is here now? There's nothing beyond.
Warren Hansen saw the game as needing to move into a more professional look, a more professional feel.
I never felt as an athlete curling in the 60s and 70s that we were looked at like other athletes were. We were something that was different. Oh yeah, that's curling. It's not really a sport. They smoke when they play, they're not in shape. And I wanted to change all that.
Warren Hansen was the first paid employee of the Canadian Curling Association, so really he went from being a curler to being a bureaucrat of the game.
And I became obsessed with trying to make this whole thing better. I was a leading factor behind having smoking not being allowed on the playing surface at the 1980 Brier in Calgary. And of course, the critics were coming from everywhere as to how dare the Canadian Curling Association do this.
It was in the 80s where things started to change. As far as Eddie's concerned, maybe not all for the better.
The problem I had is they kept doing silly things.
Warren Hansen thought every team should have a coach, maybe even a trainer.
Yes, sir. Sure.
I can't see how you can have a situation where a coach can walk out and tell you what shot to play.
The Wodja has curled magnificently today. 93% done.
Eddie Wernick thinks the players themselves can decide what happens on the ice. Warren Hansen was about having officials.
How can this sport ever gain the acknowledgement and recognition it has to receive without proper officiating?
It was controversial. It infuriated a lot of people and a lot of curlers. Curlers were not happy.
God damn it! I want to see the head official now! Now!
The players thought the officials were making enough mistakes that they were incompetent.
I think it's people that just want control of stuff. They want to be seen and heard, but they have no idea what they're talking about.
Ed Wernick was a farmer from Benito, Manitoba. He's a blue-collar guy. And Warren was the establishment. Warren represented this idea that curling should evolve very quickly into something more clinical than we knew about the sport. It was definitely personal between Eddie and Warren Hansen.
He came from the sport in the 60s and 70s, and certainly he brought with him the attitudes about the sport of curling from the 60s.
We practiced day in and day out. We worked hard. We played every weekend. They would sit around the boardroom and somebody would walk out and say, oh, let's do this. Well, that's totally wrong, and it's totally unfair to the teams and the game.
The curlers started calling Warren Hansen the dictator. What you saw was this rising tension between the CCA, represented by Warren Hansen, and on the other side, the curlers, represented by Eddie Wernick. They both wanted improvements to the game, but they both wanted it in different aspects. Eddie thought that, they should be worried about things like ice conditions, whereas Warren Hansen and the CCA was thinking of how do the players look, and how can we make this more of a presentation and sell it to sponsors. It was a real battle between the two sides. And they were really on a collision course. You could see the two sides coming to a head, especially when it appeared that curling might get into the Olympics in Calgary. In the mid-1980s, we learned that Calgary was going to host the 1988 Olympics, which was a huge opportunity. In the Olympics in those days, they allowed the host committee to try and bring in some new sports as a demonstration. They weren't official sports, they were called demonstration sports. Warren Hansen was thinking that curling would make a perfect sport in the Olympics. So he contacted a friend of his named Ray Kingsmith, who was an Alberta curling official who was very well connected in the sporting world.
Him and I were good friends, and certainly we had talked in the 70s about what we're going to do together to move this sport forward. And I said, what do you think we can do to get curling as a demonstration sport in Calgary in '88? He says, I don't know, but I'll find out. We would have to do a presentation along with the other sports that had currently shown an interest in becoming demonstration.
Calgary was the first winter host city to have an extended winter games. But now we had to fill up those extra days with programming. We liked short track speed skating, we liked freestyle skiing, and then of course, curling gave us a dynamic presentation. We wanted all three. I just don't know how it's going to go over, but we're going to try. When the International Olympic Committee was looking at our proposal, they were looking at it from a television component. What is going to sell on television? Well, short track speed skating, a good seller. Freestyle skiing, a good seller. Curling, a lot of the IOC members from Africa and South America had never seen or heard of it before. How we sold it was that freestyle skiing is down the hill, boom, over with. Short track speed skating is around the rink, boom, over with. Curling went on and on and on. So you're going to have all this footage to fall back on if there is a postponement of an Olympic event.
I think we've convinced them now that we can help them to generate more money. And money talks in the IOC, believe me.
I got this call from Ray. He says, well, we've made it.
And one of the country's favorite sports, curling, will be a demonstration sport at the 1988 Winter Olympics in Calgary.
I just couldn't believe it. It never crossed my mind that curling would be in the Olympics.
The old guard in curling didn't really know what to think about the Olympics. Could it possibly be as important as the Brier?
I was kind of excited because it just meant there was another event that we could play in.
Warren Hansen and Gary DeBlanc and all these people at the CCA were just thinking, this is the greatest thing in the world. And then all of a sudden they realized, wow, now we got to do this. We've really got to do this.
The huge challenge that I saw ahead of us was putting this sport forward in a light that's going to make it look like it's got to become accepted as an Olympic medal sport. Curlers had to be like other athletes. We had to make sure that what we put forward would show curling in the light as being an athletic activity, not unlike any other sport that was in the Olympics. And that was going to be, to some degree, the challenge, because we didn't have that universal acceptance by the curling world at that point in time that that's who we were.
They decided they were going to have trials, but before that, they wanted to have these camps. So they were going to have one in Eastern Canada and one in Western Canada.
We were going to invite about 80 curlers to 2 camps. We would go through an entire evaluation process of every athlete.
The selection criteria wasn't by team, it was by individual, which is quite odd because it's a team sport.
The CCA committee, they want to choose their dream team. They were going to pick certain curlers, okay, and make up their dream team.
A number of our top teams said, no, we're not going through that process.
I told them that my team will come, but if you try to break up my team, don't even waste my time.
We looked at it as an opportunity. We decided we wanted to try anything that was new.
So we go to the summer camp in Mississauga, Golf and Country Club, pretty fancy, couldn't wear jeans. Here we are, and we don't know what we're in for.
There was on-ice drills. Like you had to play certain shots, and they would rate you.
We knew they could curl, we watched them play, but we didn't know really what their skill abilities were. We didn't know anything about their mental capacity with regard to the sport, and we sure knew nothing about their physical fitness levels.
Included with that were physical tryouts and a lot of denials on the case of some people.
We had to weigh in, do sit-ups, ride a bike, everything.
One of the fun things was like, I'd go in and watch Eddie and a whole bunch of guys would be around the window and Eddie'd be in there trying to do sit-ups. And then it was my turn and I'm having the same problem.
It was kind of the clashing of the old boys club and this new fitness era. He had a minute to do sit-ups. They credited him with a half, but try to beat him. And then it got a little weirder. We got into the psychological stuff, which none of us had ever done.
There was a 4-page questionnaire with some interesting questions.
I mean, they asked whether you believed in Santa Claus.
Did you peak at Christmas? Did you live on the right side of the tracks? I'm looking around thinking, is this some kind of a joke?
Nobody at that thing had ever dealt with a sports psychologist.
And it was unbelievable. Like, I just curled 86%. What's this got to do with?
The other part of the interview process was asking you who you would and would not play with. Our team went into it saying we would play any position that would make a team stronger.
Generally, they thought this is a good idea. But there was a few that were high profile that thought, we don't need this, and you can't really tell us what to do.
I remember Gary DeBlonde wanted a one-on-one meeting with me. He walks in with his briefcase, slops it down, opens it up as if like he's got gold in there. And I said, Gary, before we even start, I want to get something straight. I says, there's nothing you can do to enhance my team. The only thing you can do is keep the beer cold. So he looked at me, closed the briefcase, says, the meeting's over.
The camps became very controversial. The media started commenting on it, but it was really just the tip of the iceberg compared to what was next.
They're not the least bit interested in having the best curlers. They want the curlers that fit into their mold. That's a crock of manure.
In late 1986, after these camps, the CCA got together and decided who they were going to invite to the Olympic trials. And they invited some intact teams, and then they assembled some all-star teams of players who had never curled together before. But before they could all come to the Olympic trials, the CCA did something very, very extraordinary. They put some stipulations on some of the best curlers in the world. Eddie Wernick, Paul Savage, and a handful of others were going to have to lose weight, in some cases up to 20 pounds, before they were going to be allowed to show up at the Olympic trials.
The good news is you're in. The bad news is you and Eddie need to lose some weight and you need to improve your fitness levels.
I'm sure they disliked me to start with, but a lot had to do with my physique. I was a target for the CCA. They didn't want a portly, short, cocky guy representing the country.
But on the other side of the coin, he agreed to come and play that game. And as a result of agreeing to be there, you need to be prepared to accept the results.
Eddie loved the sport. He would do anything for the sport. But to go after him because of the way that he looked was declaring war.
The media just absolutely exploded with this.
The whole weight controversy was a national story.
You have to lose, what, 20 pounds?
What they're probably trying to do is get me to get rid of my beer belly, I guess.
All of a sudden, a whole bunch of people who never had an interest in curling in their life, going right down to Don Cherry, had an opinion of why this was ridiculous, this wasn't curling, and how could one of the best players in the game, Ed Wernick, be made to have to go through all this?
Why are you trying to tamper with what's already good?
I think the word tamper is not the appropriate word.
I had a lot of frustration trying so hard to get the physical component and the whole cosmetic aspect better than it had been.
I have the feeling that they would be much happier if we failed and then they had a reason to eliminate us from the program.
The manner in how that was taken and twisted and made to look like, to some degree, we were fools and what did we think we were doing? This is curling. Personally, it took a huge toll on me. I felt, certainly during that period of time, that I was a one-man war against a lot of the sport.
I can understand why they wanted to have a team that had the right cosmetics, but it was just so against the fabric of the game. They were really looking for something that didn't exist.
Heck, Gervais, 4 times Alberta champion, twice Canadian champion, once world champion, and he was almost 300 pounds.
The game was stuck between the old traditions and moving towards something new. For a lot of players at the time, it was just a real message that the game was changing and the game would change forever.
I'm going to give it an effort. Obviously, I owe that to my teammates to give it a chance.
I think one of the things that motivated us for Eddie to lose the weight and for me to lose the weight was we thought that we would jeopardize the opportunity for John and Neil to play in the Olympics. So, you know, we gave it our best shot.
There were cameras everywhere. They were following them as they worked out at the gym, as they were eating meals. It was a real blow-by-blow reality show before there were reality shows of Ed and Paul lose weight. I can remember going to a lunch with Ed Wernick and seeing him eat this salad, and it was like a bare bones salad with like lemon juice on it or something like that, and you could not imagine a more unhappy human being in the world than this poor guy.
Eddie could have just said, stick it, shove it, to say, I'm not going to do it, I don't care. But Eddie loved curling, and Eddie wanted to curl in the Olympics, so he was going to do it. And I think in the back of Eddie's mind, I think he wanted to pass that fitness test so he could tell Warren to shove it.
Eddie and I had to go to the fitness center at York University to be retested, and you would not believe the media there.
That was jammed, the hallways were jammed, there was cameras from everywhere. But I says, everything's fine, it's cool, Eddie's gonna be playing.
So the Olympic trials start, and the curlers start to curl. And one thing becomes clear right off the top is that these all-star teams are not going to cut it. They just simply weren't going to gel. But the other thing that happened is Ed Wernick, the lighter version of Ed Wernick, with all this weight loss, he really couldn't curl like he used to.
Jesus. Oh, I'm so mad. Because of that weight loss, it affected my delivery. I couldn't throw. What happened was my delivery had got so low that I started to hook everything. And I was just plain awful.
He was a great curler as the portly guy, and the CCA tells him to lose all this weight, and now he can't curl.
What they did to Ed Wernick was basically throw his game right off. The sport that he loved all of a sudden attacked him.
You can just be sure that in the back room somewhere, the CCA officials were just celebrating.
A group of CCA officials that I saw leaving the arena, the George Bell Arena, after we lost our semifinal game in the trials, and they all had big grins on their faces. I mean, they were so relieved.
Warren Hansen stayed so far away from me, he knew that it was not a good idea to get in my face.
I think it was more the fact of what I represented versus who I was. He looked at me as the face of curling that wanted to change all these things and do all these things.
There was just too much bad blood.
It really didn't die there, and it followed us right into the Olympics in Calgary.
I couldn't stand him then, couldn't stand him later, and I can't stand him now.
It damaged the whole process, it damaged everything. We went into 1988 thinking if we did a really good job of putting this sport forward in Calgary, that it would become medal. That wasn't going to be the case at all.
In February of 1988, the Olympics start in Calgary. And curling thinks this is going to be our coming out party. This is where we're going to show the world what we're all about. At the end of the Olympic trials, the two teams that were selected were Linda Moore's team from Vancouver and Ed Lukowicz's team from Calgary. And they were perfect representatives. They were exactly what the CCA was looking for.
Fitness should be an element in our sport just as it is in any other sport. I think it's just common sense that the fitter the athlete, the better that that person will perform.
Tickets were sold out for weeks and months ahead of the event, and even though Max Bell only held 2,500 people, we were expecting to be capacity.
At the end of the day, the Canadian teams performed very well.
We knew going into Calgary there would be an asterisk next to curling because it was a demonstration sport, but that was never in our minds. It was very special. We were in the ceremonies and we had a ceremony for our gold medals. That was just an amazing feeling.
At the end of the day, despite all the controversies, they thought they'd done enough to maybe convince the Olympic officials that curling deserved to be a full medal sport. That wasn't going to be the case.
The International Olympic Committee decided, no, not ready for you right now.
The strikes that certainly came against curling was number one, the huge media campaign that was launched against the whole camp process because of the weight loss thing.
I've had trouble with Curl Canada all along the lines. They've basically taken a stranglehold of our game, and they can do as they please, and they do whatever they please, whenever they please, and fed-up curlers are getting upset.
Created huge interest within Canada from the media. Didn't shine a good light in what we were doing. I think the second thing that happened was they had a requirement that said there had to be a minimum of 26 countries participating at the world level for Olympic medal, but at the same time there were more than one sport that did not have 26 countries. So it was a reason they could lean on, along with the other things that had taken place that said, we'll just push that over there for now. We were pretty dejected. There was more than one occasion where I felt the feeling of why am I doing this? For whatever reasons, I continued to push forward. I was still trying to make the sport bigger, better, and more accepted.
After 1988, Eddie Wernick, the great Eddie Wernick, had disappeared. Everything about his game came apart. That looked like that was going to be the end of Ed Wernick.
Ed Wernick struggled for a couple of years. And I'm sure, what was going through his mind at the time was, I'm done.
Oh, it was easy putting the weight back on. But I was contemplating at that time, cutting back in the curling. I wasn't having a lot of fun. I wasn't playing very good. The phone rings. It's John Kawaja. He says, what are you doing? I says, well, I just got home and I'm trying to decide what I'm going to do. I got a team for you, he says.
We got back together in the fall of 1989, and it was almost like Ed woke up one day and said, I'm not done.
I started making shots again. Everybody started making shots.
If 1983 was Dream Team, 1990 was Dream Team Revisited.
Eventually, he made his way to the Briar. As the boys called it, it was a bar hopping spree up in Sault Ste. Marie.
We were just shooting the lights out.
7 years after Eddie Wernick had last curled in the Briar, Eddie Wernick's coming back.
And Warren Hansen can see this. He knows what's coming down the line if Ed wins.
I'm well aware that if Ed wins, there's going to be a problem. Because at that time, I was the men's team leader.
Warren Hansen was the coach for Canada when Canada would go towards the World Curling Championships.
He's trashed me, and he's dead against our whole coaching program and team leader program. But I knew he would do something that would be pretty spectacular.
So we won, and there's press everywhere. First guy sticks a microphone in my face. He says, "What do you think of having Warren Hansen as your coach?" I says, "He's fired." Well, hold that.
Oh dear.
The shit just hit the fan.
You had one controversy after another, then you're going to have the ultimate, the firing of the national team coach.
I don't think Eddie would think of it as revenge. I mean, he just didn't want any part of anybody associated with Warren or the CCA.
And Warren Hansen backs off, and Eddie Wernick is in seventh heaven. It was just his way of saying, this is the way curling should be. We don't need coaches, and I'm going to put my foot down and show you how.
It's kind of ironic that after I put the weight back on, I went on and won another world championship.
You had to feel a little sorry for Warren Hansen because, man, oh man, the amount of abuse that he took, it was a lot.
Well, you can say it's going to wash off you as much as you want, and you can say, no, it doesn't matter to me, but it does. I mean, that's very damaging and hurtful to anybody. My efforts out here for, at this point in time, 15 years, have been to try and move this sport forward, and he doesn't get it.
By 1990, there's a lot of changes going on in the game. The corn brooms are gone. Everybody's using a push broom. The ice conditions are so much better. And there's rule changes. The first iterations of the free guard zone are now in there. It's becoming a more offensive game. It's becoming a very television-friendly game with lots more rocks in play. And again, at this stage, curling again gets brought up in front of the International Olympic Committee. In 1991, the World Curling Federation met the minimum number of countries.
And it was rejected for the second time.
Around this time, we find out that the 1998 Olympics are going to be held in Nagano, Japan.
I had established some fairly substantial connections in Japan.
Hiroshi Kobayashi could be the most important person on the Olympic story. He's called Mr. Curler over there. He's famous.
Hiroshi Kobayashi told me that there was either one or two Japanese Olympic Committee people sitting on this program commission, and that they would be speaking strongly in favor of curling becoming a medal sport in 1998. There was then an opportunity to have a third presentation to the IOC in 1992. And this was the one that everybody stood back and said, this is do or die. If this one doesn't go, it's never going to go. I received this phone call from Hiroshi, who asks me who Mr. Ken Reid is. Ken Reid's a skier in Canada. Why do you ask? Why would he speak against curling?
Ken Reid voted against it. He didn't think curling was a sport like a lot of people did at the time, so you can't blame him.
I think what Ken Reid was thinking was what a lot of people were thinking at that point was if curling gets in the Olympics, darts and ballroom dancing be far behind. Curling was turned down for the third time at a vote at the IOC, and I think a lot of people thought that's it, 3 strikes and you're out.
Deep down inside, thought it was probably done. And I remember Hiroshi telling me at that time that this was not over, this would not be the end of it.
In the early 1990s, the chairman of the International Olympic Committee is a guy named Juan Antonio Samaranch. Juan Antonio Samaranch somehow developed a soft spot for curling.
The very strange thing that happens, in my opinion, is for the third time, the Program Commission again recommended that the sport of curling not be a medal sport. Mr. Juan Antonio Samaranch looked them in the eye and said, I would suggest you go back and reconsider. And reconsider they did, because to my amazement and many others, the sport in June of 1992 became metal. And probably nobody will ever really know why.
Kobayashi with Samaranch's help, in my mind, single-handedly got curling in the Olympics.
In 1997, they had the trials for the 1998 Olympics.
One name just jumps right out, and there it is, Ed Wernick. They were starting to win games. They were knocking off all the big teams.
I beat Russ Howard, Wayne Madaw, and made the playoffs. They're getting nervous.
Every single moment, the Canadian Curling Association was probably thinking, Lord, please do not let Ed Wernick win these trials.
Ed Wernick, in the end of the day, finished third. He played very well, but just couldn't quite get over the hump. An unheralded team, Mike Harris from Toronto, won the right to go and represent Canada, and then Sandra Schmerler from Saskatchewan also was going to go and represent Canada for the women. The Nagano Olympics were huge for curling. Sandra Schmerler winning gold was one of the highlights, I think, of the Olympic Games. It's still a highlight of the Olympic Games. It's still a highlight for me. I still get chills when I see that last shot coming down the ice.
All the history, all the controversies leading up to this point, it didn't matter because Canada was finally in the Olympics. This was the moment that had been waited for a long time. This is what Warren Hansen had planned in his mind a long time ago.
If you look at the level that we're playing at, the skill and athleticism required for it, yeah, there's no question about it. It belongs in the Olympic Games.
As soon as curling was included in the Olympics as a full medal sport, it changed the sport forever.
I think since the sport has become medal, since 1998, it has taken on a whole life of its own.
He's a smart guy. He has a huge passion for curling, and I think he sees probably 2 or 3 steps down the road a little bit.
I have agreed with all of it. A lot of the curls haven't agreed with all of it. But when you look back, Warren has done more for this sport. He's helped get the Olympics in. He's made the Brier a world-class event, the Scott a world-class event.
You notice all the curlers out there now, they're chiseled, they're unbelievable. They can run for miles, sweep for miles, curl all day.
If you want to get better and keep up with everybody that's evolving, then you have to look at each aspect of the game, and that would include sports psychology, physical training, on-ice preparation, and work with professionals because they know better than we do at how to be better, and it really has, to me, made us better players.
The ice is better, the equipment is better, everything is better. It's almost too perfect. It was a lot more loosey-goosey in the old days than it is now. It was more social. It was a lot of fun.
So there's a little bit of sadness for the fact that it used to be kind of an everyman sport, and it's not that way. It's no longer the case that you can kind of string together, as John Kawaja said, 2 really good curlers and a couple of plumbers and win the Brier. You know, those days are gone. These guys are professionals.
Everybody asks me, like, you never made the Olympics. And to be totally honest with you, it's probably a good thing that I didn't. By this time, I was getting to be pretty, yeah, I guess you'd call it arrogant at times. I think the sport has changed for the worse in a lot of ways. They've taken all the fun out of the game. It doesn't seem to be growing like it should be.
In some ways, curling has kind of grown up and become a big league sport. But in a lot of ways, it's lost that innocence when it joined the Olympics.
Curling has done very well. My end of thinking, it's like everything else in this world. If it's really, really going to go, the Americans have to grab a hold of it. I'm one of the key people behind the Continental Cup. We're going into the show capital of the world with a major curling event into a gorgeous 7,000-seat arena, and it's going to make a considerable mark on the sport of curling in the United States.
When I first heard the Continental Cup was going to Vegas, I thought, Vegas? And then you start thinking this might not be a crazy idea, but it's brilliant. It really is.
In retrospect, the things that Warren Hansen tried to do for the sport of curling undeniably were with the right spirit, intentions, and ultimately, I think, have done the sport of curling a lot of good. The process at the time was really disappointing and somewhat difficult to really understand. There wasn't a relationship between the best players in the world and the governing body that really made the rules and ran the competitions.
Maybe I would have approached some aspects of what we were trying to do differently. Maybe more consultation at times might have been better.
When you look back at Ed Wernick and Warren Hansen, the funny thing for me is that they really both wanted the same thing. I mean, they both wanted curling to go to the big time, to be successful. But this battle they had between them, in some ways, is really what fueled the game and brought a lot of attention to it. So, while personally there might have been a lot of angst and a lot of resentment between the two of them, I think in some weird way it really kind of benefited the game.
The Canadian Curling Association always claimed that they were trying to take curling to the next level. The game succeeded on its own merits and because of the curlers, and it will always succeed because it's a great game.
I would hope my legacy to curling will be somebody who made it better, improved it, brought it into a new age. It's heading down a new avenue, a new potential bright future for it. I may be wrong, but then again, I may be right.